What would you do if, one stormy night, your children found a strange creature by the creek? Gray fur, wounded skin, and dark, sorrowful eyes that seemed almost human. And it knocked 3 times, as if calling for help. The Salish people whisper of the High Walker, a sacred forest being from the Bitterroot Mountains. But this one had scars from human chains. It had once been locked in a basement like a forgotten pet from a darker past. This story comes from the Parker family, people who lived in a wooden cabin at the forest's edge and one day became the unexpected guardians of a young Bigfoot. What follows is not just a tale of mystery, but of deep connection, from fear to love, from captivity to reunion. It's a journey that shows what truly makes someone family. They named him Tahu, and though he once trembled in fear, clinging to the children like his last hope, he would later return to the forest, not without first placing his hand to his chest in a silent farewell, a gesture he learned from the humans who loved him. Don't miss this story. It only happened once. But if you believe in kindness, in nature, and in the unbreakable bond between worlds, it will stay with you forever. The Bitterroot Valley was the kind of place where seasons moved slow, like an old man crossing the street with a stubborn limp. It sat low in the cradle of the mountains, where fog clung to the fields in the mornings and the stars hung heavy over the pines at night. Folks out here didn't ask for much. A roof that didn't leak, warm food in winter, and peace, above all else. Peace. The Parker family had found that peace years ago. Their cabin sat near the edge of Salish land, a modest structure framed by hand-cut timber and wrapped in the kind of silence only distance could buy. John Parker was a carpenter, built the place with his own 2 hands, every nail a quiet promise to his wife Linda and their 2 kids, Anna and Luke. He worked with wood like it was something sacred. Linda taught at the local elementary school. She drove the old Ford into town every weekday and read bedtime stories every night. She smelled like pencil shavings and peppermint tea. The children were small, but sharp. Anna had the heart of a poet. Luke, younger by 2 years, had the knees of an adventurer, always scraped up and grass-stained. They lived simply. No cable, no neighbors for miles. But there was laughter in the walls, the kind that didn't need much to keep going. On the western ridge of their property was the border. Unmarked, unspoken, but real. That land belonged to the Salish. Not in papers, but in blood. The Parkers respected that. They never hunted beyond the creek, never cut trees near the old stones. And sometimes, in the evenings, the elder from the tribe, a man whose name sounded like wind-scraping bark, would come and sit with John by the fire pit. He told stories. Some were about wolves, others about the tall ones of the high wood. He never said Bigfoot. He didn't need to. That night, the storm came down hard. Rain drummed the roof like it was trying to get in. The wind screamed through the trees like it remembered something awful. Luke had nightmares. Anna curled up in the blankets, eyes wide. Linda lit the old oil lamp. Power went out around midnight. The house glowed amber and quiet. John sat by the window, watching the trees shudder like they were afraid too. Then came the knocking. 3 knocks, sharp, deliberate. From the trees beyond the porch, not wind, not branch, something chosen. John's breath caught. Linda stood still, halfway to the fireplace. Anna whispered, "Did you hear that?" Luke was already clutching her arm. John reached for the flashlight, though it barely worked in the rain. He stepped onto the porch, the world dripping around him like a dream half-remembered. The woods in front of him were blacker than black, but then, movement. Just a flicker near the creek bed. Something low to the ground, not running, crawling. He followed the faint outline past the fence. Mud pulled at his boots. The storm muffled all sound. But what he found by the water made the night go completely still. It was small. Not a bear, not a child. curled against a mossy rock, soaked to the bone, shivering. It had grayish fur, matted with dirt and rain, long limbs curled tight like it was trying to disappear. But it was the eyes that stopped John. They were wide, black as tar, and full of a fear that didn't come from the storm. A deeper kind. The kind you only saw in something that had been hurt too many times. He didn't speak. Just took off his flannel, wrapped it around the creature like instinct. It didn't fight, didn't growl, just let out a faint broken sound. Not quite a cry, not quite a breath. And when John lifted it into his arms, he felt the weight of something more than just a body. Back at the cabin, Linda gasped. Anna stepped back. Luke hid behind her, but nobody screamed. Not even when they saw its face. There were old scars along its wrists, jagged, like something had tried to keep it in chains. Its nails were short, dirty, like it had clawed through things. But its gaze, that's what kept them all frozen, was not wild. It was human. Linda moved first. Always did. She knelt, whispered, "It's okay," and brought a warm towel. She didn't ask what it was. She only asked what it needed. Anna and Luke stared as the creature sat on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, steam rising off its wet fur in the glow of the lamp. It blinked slowly, eyes never leaving the flame, like it remembered something, like it didn't believe it was real. John tossed another log into the stove. Nobody spoke for a long while. Rain tapped on the windows. Thunder wandered off toward the valley. And then, as if on cue, the front door creaked open. It was the elder. Somehow, through that storm, he had come. His coat was soaked, but his face was calm. He looked at the creature, then at John, then at Linda. He didn't flinch. He knelt, touched the creature's arm gently, and whispered something in Salish. The creature blinked. The elder turned to them and spoke in English, low and tired. "It is one of ours, taken long ago, from the mountain family. It has seen cages, man's cruelty. But you found it, you cared. Now it will call, and they will hear." John didn't ask how the elder had known to come. He didn't need to. Linda whispered, "We should name it while it's here." Anna's voice broke the silence. "Tahu." It sounded like it belonged to the mountains. That night, after the fire died low, and the rain faded to a whisper, Tahu stood in the living room. He picked up a broken piece of kindling from the basket, held it in both hands like a gift, then walked to the cabin's center beam. He raised it, paused, and knocked, once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed, heavy in the stillness. From the trees beyond the window, nothing answered. But the family? They all felt it. Something ancient had been awakened. Something watching, something waiting. And deep inside the boy creature's eyes, there was no longer just fear. There was memory, and something even harder to name, hope. It took days for the storm to fully let go of the valley. Even after the rain stopped, the trees held on to it, dripping slow and steady, as if they too needed time to shake off whatever the night had brought. Inside the Parker cabin, the air was thick with wood smoke and something quieter, a kind of hush that lingered in the corners. No one spoke about the 3 knocks. They didn't have to. The memory hung in the room like steam on cold glass. Tahu slept most of the next day, curled tight on the old flannel blanket near the stove, chest rising and falling in soft, uneven rhythms, as if his body wasn't sure yet if it could trust rest. His fur, now dry, revealed more than they'd seen the night before. There were markings along his arms and back, not birthmarks, not natural. Faint scars in uneven patterns, some circular, others like lines broken mid-scratch. Around his wrists were the deepest, raised, darkened, as if something had been there, long enough to leave a memory. Linda noticed them first when she tried to bring him warm tea in a chipped blue mug. Tahu blinked slowly, eyes darting to her hands, then to the floor. He didn't reach out, didn't flinch either, just watched, like someone who'd been taught the world could turn cruel in an instant. She placed the cup on the floor nearby, careful not to crowd him. Luke and Anna hovered at a distance. Children had a way of knowing when something needed silence. Still, their curiosity buzzed under their skin. Anna held Luke's hand and whispered questions he didn't answer. It was on the second day that Tahu stood on his own. Not all the way up, not like a person, but somewhere between a crouch and a slouch, limbs long and oddly graceful. He moved with caution, like every step might be the last safe one, but he didn't run. He didn't growl. He walked over to the window, pressed one furred hand against the cold glass, and stared out at the trees. Anna crept closer, slow and careful. She reached into the cabinet and pulled out one of her markers, blue, her favorite, and a leftover grocery bag flattened smooth on the kitchen table. She slid it toward him, then stepped back. Tahu didn't move for a long time. Then, quietly, he picked up the marker. His fingers were clumsy, like he was trying to remember how hands worked. But he held it tight, bent over the paper, and drew. He didn't draw faces, or houses, or anything a child might scribble on a Sunday afternoon. He drew symbols, circles split by lines, shapes that resembled trees but weren't. One looked like a mountain, but the peaks had eyes. John watched from the hallway, arms crossed. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and shadows stretched long across the valley, Elder Wakan returned. He brought no bag, no cane, only the weight of something he had known would come. Tahu froze when the door opened. His eyes locked onto Wakan's face, and for a moment, the room stopped breathing. The old man stepped closer, nodded once, and knelt to Tahu's level. He didn't speak at first, just looked. Not through him, not past him, at him, with the kind of gaze that recognized pain. "You've come far," Wakan finally said, voice like gravel in the wind. "Longer than any young one should travel alone." John pulled out a chair. Linda poured tea. The cabin creaked under the weight of old stories, making room for new ones. Wakan told them Tahu was not just a creature, not a beast. He was a child. Taken. Stolen during a night when fire lit the forest edge and machines broke the silence of sacred ground. He spoke of a group, outsiders, men with cages, who had come decades ago, believing they could capture what was never meant to be owned. Some were caught, most were not. But one young one had vanished. "That was nearly 10 winters past," Wakan whispered. "We thought he was gone." He placed a weathered hand on Tahu's shoulder. "But blood remembers." Tahu didn't make a sound. He reached up and touched the beads on Wakan's necklace, tracing them with a kind of recognition that didn't need words. Linda leaned in. "What do we do now?" Wakan looked at her, tired but steady. "You care for him, as you would your own. They will come when it is time, but now he needs your kindness." No one argued. There was nothing to argue against. That night, the cabin didn't sleep easy. The wind had stilled, but the air was heavy, like it was holding back something big. Tahu curled up near the fireplace again, but this time, Anna lay beside him with a pillow, and Luke brought him one of his stuffed animals, a moose with one antler. John sat on the porch long after the lamp was out, watching the trees shift in the moonlight. Sometime past midnight, a faint sound echoed from inside. Tap, tap, tap. 3 knocks, not loud, not outside. From the living room beam, he turned and saw Tahu, small against the darkness, standing again with a piece of kindling in his hand. He looked at the wood like it remembered something older than the house itself. Then, with one last glance toward the woods beyond the glass, he placed the stick down, walked to the couch, and curled back into the warmth. John didn't move for a while. He just stood there, listening, waiting, feeling the deep, slow shift of a world that no longer followed the rules it used to. And in that silence, there was no fear, only the slow beginning of something they didn't have words for, yet. By the end of the first week, the cabin had changed, not in size or shape, but in the way it breathed. like the walls were learning to hold more than just heat and old memories. Tahu didn't speak, not in any way people understood, but he made himself known. In the early mornings, he'd sit with his legs crossed by the window, back straight, eyes focused beyond the trees. At breakfast, he'd reach for the fish first, tearing into the skin with quiet precision, the way a wild animal might, though nothing about him felt wild anymore. And at night, when the fire cast long shadows up the walls, he'd curl against the couch with his chin on his knees, watching cartoons with Luke like it was the most natural thing in the world. Linda had brought out an old quilt she'd been saving, her mother's, and folded it just right before laying it across his back the first time he dozed off in the living room. The corners were frayed, the stitching loose. But Tahu had clutched it with both hands, pulling it over himself like a memory. Anna had started talking to him as if he understood every word. She didn't wait for responses, just told him what she'd learned in school that day, or what kind of cloud she thought the one over the barn looked like. Tahu listened, or at least he didn't walk away. Luke was harder to read. He was younger, and the newness of it all still wrapped around him like a cold wind. But one afternoon, when Linda came in from hanging laundry and found Luke trying to teach Tahu how to use crayons on butcher paper, she didn't say a word, just watched from the doorway, hand over her heart. Tahu held the crayon wrong, clenched, but he watched Luke carefully, copied, then scribbled something, not shapes, not drawings, but patterns, repeated loops, stacked marks, like language, but not one from any book on their shelves. John kept his distance more than the rest. He'd grown up building things that followed rules, frames that held weight, hinges that didn't squeak. This didn't follow rules. This was something he couldn't hammer into place. But even he started leaving scraps of smoked salmon near Tahu's plate. Little offerings, small things, but honest. And still, there were moments, like when Tahu would suddenly freeze by the fireplace and stare at nothing. Like when a thunderclap rolled through the valley and he bolted under the table, shaking until Linda knelt beside him and whispered soft reassurances. Or when he'd sit in the dirt behind the house and carve lines into the earth with his fingers, over and over, like digging up something he'd buried long ago. One evening, as the sky turned gold and the birds began their quiet hymn before night, Linda stepped onto the porch and found Tahu crouched near the edge of the yard. He wasn't alone. Anna sat beside him, her small fingers weaving dandelions into a loop. Tahu held one in his hand, gently, almost reverently. She placed the crown on his head, and for a moment, he didn't move. Then, and only then, he let out a sound, a low, breathy exhale. Not quite laughter, but close. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, John lingered near the back window. The forest loomed, quiet and full. He sipped his coffee, half cold, and stared into the tree line. Something moved, not wind, not deer, shapes, tall, still, watching. They didn't move forward, didn't call out, just stood, as if waiting. He didn't wake Linda, didn't want to scare the kids. He just stood there, gripping the edge of the sink, the moonlight casting long shadows across the tile. Tahu appeared behind him, silent as fog, his eyes fixed on the same place John was staring, and for the first time, John saw it, a flicker in those deep black eyes. Not fear, not surprise, but understanding. He lifted one hand, slowly, and pressed it against the window, a mirror image of the night John had found him, then turned, walked back into the dark hallway. The day stretched, slow and warm. Spring crept into the valley with its usual stubborn charm. Patches of green showing up in unexpected places, birds louder at dawn, the air smelling less like smoke and more like rain-soaked pine. Tahu had begun to mimic more. He sat at the table, never ate from a plate, but waited until Linda placed food in front of him. He'd learned to open the screen door without tearing it, knew where the creek was, knew not to cross the fence line. But most haunting of all, he started drawing again. Not just with crayons, with sticks, with ash from the fireplace, on walls, on floors. Always the same kind of shapes, spirals, eyes, handprints with extra fingers. Once, Linda found him tracing something into the dirt behind the shed. She thought it was just another pattern, until she realized it was a map of the valley, their cabin, the ridgeline, the creek, and a point marked deeper in the woods with a jagged, deliberate X. She didn't mention it to John. Not yet. On a Sunday, just before supper, Tahu walked over to the bookcase, pulled down one of Anna's picture books, and sat with it in his lap. He didn't flip pages, just stared at the cover, a forest, drawn in soft greens and browns, with cartoon deer and wide-eyed owls. Anna sat beside him, whispered, "That's where you came from, huh?" Tahu turned his head, looked at her, then pressed his finger to one of the trees on the cover. Linda watched from the kitchen and felt a sudden tightness in her chest. That night, while cleaning up, she found one of the pages from Luke's notebook near the fireplace. It had been torn out, covered in Tahu's symbols, but beneath them, drawn in pencil with a child's uncertain hand, was a single shape, a stick figure, holding hands with a smaller, fur-covered figure. Both smiling, the fire crackled low as Linda held the page. Something was changing, and it wasn't just Tahu. By mid-April, the trees had turned restless. The wind picked up earlier in the day. The creek ran louder. Birds cut across the sky in jagged, uneasy lines. The mountains stayed still, but the feeling underneath it all, it changed. And the town, even with its distance, even with the long dirt road and the ridge that kept most folks away, started to whisper. It began with the kids, not Anna and Luke. Other kids, the ones in town. They talked about strange things on the playground, about shadows in the tree line near the old quarry, about how someone's dog wouldn't stop barking at the barn for hours, about a howling that didn't sound like any coyote. A girl from Linda's second-grade class said her older brother swore he saw a figure squatting in the ravine, huge and hairy, holding what looked like a deer. No one believed him, but the story stuck. Then came the footprints. Jack Dorsey, who ran the bait shop and liked to hunt elk out by the North Bluff, showed up at the cafe with pictures. Not printed, not fancy, just Polaroids. He slapped them on the counter, pale from spring frost. Everyone leaned in. They were massive, bare. Toes spread wide in the soft mud. No boots, no shoes, and too wide to be human. Jack claimed he measured them at nearly 16 inches long. Linda heard about it from the post office. John from the mechanic shop. The same day, 2 older boys snuck out past sundown and claimed they'd heard breathing in the woods, right behind them. They didn't go back. And then it got closer. One morning before sunrise, John found the chicken coop door hanging open. No blood, no feathers, just open. A single egg left cracked on the ground. The latch hadn't been broken, just unhooked. Clean, careful. That same afternoon, Linda overheard 3 women at the grocery store murmuring about a creature living somewhere off the Bitterroot edge. Said it was being hidden. That someone out there, maybe one of the old-timers, was protecting it. The air was growing heavy, like the calm before a flood. Sheriff Harold Miller paid a visit 2 days later. His cruiser crunched up the gravel just after breakfast, red dust curling around the tires. He wasn't a bad man. He knew the Parkers, knew John's work, had taught Luke how to tie his first fishing knot at the summer fair. But that morning, he didn't come with a smile. Linda opened the door, heart steady but hands cold. Tahu was in the back room with the kids, quiet as always. Harold stepped inside, removed his hat, looked around with a practiced eye. He mentioned the stories going around, asked about the footprints, said there'd been concern, said someone had heard something strange near the Parker property. A howl, maybe a growl. Something they couldn't place. John stood by the wood stove, arms crossed. He didn't offer anything. just watched. Linda spoke softly, said the kids had been hearing things, like always. Spring made the forest louder, and the mountain cats came down sometimes, hungry and confused. Harold nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Then he asked, real quiet, if they'd seen anything themselves, anything unusual. Linda held her breath for half a second too long. He noticed. I ain't accusing, Harold said. Just, folks are getting nervous. You know how it is. One story becomes 2, then 10. All I'm saying is, if there's something going on out here that could hurt somebody, better to deal with it now than after. John walked him to the door. His voice stayed even, but his eyes didn't. Ain't nothing dangerous here, Harold, just family. Harold paused, took a long look at the trees, then got in his car. That night, John didn't sleep. Sat in the rocking chair, staring at the embers, listening. And it didn't help that around 3 a.m., Anna woke up screaming. Linda ran to her room, heart in her throat. Luke sat up in the next bed, rubbing his eyes. Anna was pale, shaking, pointing toward the window. I saw them, she whispered. They were standing on the hill. Linda pulled her close. Who, baby? Anna's eyes were wet, but steady. The tall ones, like Tahu, but bigger. They didn't move, just watched. By the time John went out with the flashlight, there was nothing on the ridge. But the earth smelled turned, wet, touched. And Tahu was already awake, sitting by the fire, blanket around his shoulders, staring at the door like he knew it was coming. He didn't speak, just tapped his finger 3 times on the floor. The same rhythm, the same call. John stood there for a long while, hand on the door frame, watching that little hand drum the wood like a ghost knocking on its own house. The sky was the color of ash when the government truck pulled up the long dirt road. Not red, not gray, just something tired and heavy. Linda spotted it first, through the kitchen window while drying her hands. The seal on the door was unmistakable. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. 4 wheels, 2 people inside, and a clipboard balanced on the dash like judgment waiting to be written. John was already on the porch by the time the vehicle came to a full stop. His arms were crossed, face unreadable. Not angry, not scared, just still. Tahu stayed inside, crouched low near the wood stove, eyes fixed on the door like he already knew. Anna sat close beside him, quiet but alert. Luke clung to Linda's leg like he used to when he was smaller, and storms felt bigger than the house. The woman who stepped out wore her uniform like it meant something. Neat, zipped to the collar, silver badge catching the light. Her hair was pulled back, her boots too clean for the road she drove in on. She introduced herself as Officer Janet Harper. Behind her was a younger man, in his 40s maybe, sunken eyes and a wedding band that no longer shone. He didn't say his name. Harper shook John's hand. Firm, practiced, official. Then glanced toward the cabin, as if her job was already beginning before anyone agreed it had. We received multiple reports, she said. Unconfirmed sightings, possibly a juvenile bear or an unregistered exotic pet. Some suggested something more unusual. We're required to investigate. John didn't blink. You got a warrant? No, sir. Just authority from the department and a mandate to protect wildlife and people. Linda stepped outside then, holding Luke close. She didn't smile, but she nodded. He's not a threat. Harper tilted her head slightly. You saying you're keeping something? Linda hesitated, then opened the door wider. You can come in, but you treat him like a child, because that's what he is. They stepped inside. Tahu didn't move. He stayed crouched back to the wall, wrapped in the faded quilt. His eyes tracked every footstep, every change in breath. The younger agent looked at him, really looked, and something in his face cracked, just slightly. Harper kept her voice low, steady. What is it? He has a name, Linda said. His name is Tahu. The room was thick with a silence that couldn't be cleared by talking. John pulled a drawer from the cabinet, handed her a folder. We have a temporary wildlife rehab permit. Years back we took in an injured wolf pup. Same legal framework applies. We contacted state services when we found him. She flipped through the paperwork, jaw tight. I'm not sure this qualifies, she said finally. He's not a wolf, not anything I've seen on record, but you see he's not hurting anyone, John replied. Harper nodded slowly, then crouched, resting one hand on her thigh. Her eyes met Tahu's. We're not here to take you away, she said softly. We just need to understand what you are, what you've been through. He didn't respond, but then Anna stepped forward and reached for his hand. Tahu led her, his fingers wrapped around hers, gentle and trembling. It wasn't the hand of an animal. It wasn't the grip of a beast. It was a boy's, a wounded one. The younger agent's face turned pale, his eyes welled. He stepped back, looked down. My daughter, he said suddenly, voice catching. She passed last fall, 7 years old, same look in the eyes, like she saw something she shouldn't have. Harper's expression changed. Not completely, but enough. She stood, steadying herself. I need to file a report, she said. But I'll mark this as incomplete, for now. You'll be placed under provisional review. What does that mean? Linda asked. You've got 1 month, Harper replied. If we can't determine his species, origin, or long-term sustainability in this environment, we'll have to intervene. Relocation, maybe containment. Containment? John's voice dropped. We'll avoid it if we can, she said quickly. But he's not registered. He's not documented. There are laws. There's fear. She looked around, saw the crayon drawings on the wall, the wooden toys Luke used to play with now resting near the fireplace. A family photo, faded and cracked, tucked into the corner of the shelf. She exhaled. I don't envy you, she said. But I have a job to do. They left with the promise to return. No handcuffs, no cages. Not yet. But the countdown had started. That night, the cabin didn't feel safe. Not because of danger, but because of knowing the world had finally found its way in. Tahu didn't sleep in his usual spot. He stayed near the window, hand pressed to the glass, staring out at the dark ridge line like it might call him back. And Anna, for the first time, didn't speak. Luke sat on the floor beside Tahu and offered him the stuffed moose again. Tahu didn't take it, but he didn't walk away either. It started with a knock at dusk. Not 3 knocks, just one. Sharp, sudden. A sound that didn't carry fear, but memory. John opened the door, half expecting a deputy or another wildlife agent. But instead, there stood a woman he hadn't seen in 20 years. Young once, older now, eyes the same. Lily Carter. Her hair was damp from the fog rolling off the ridge, her jacket worn thin at the elbows. She looked like someone who'd driven too far without stopping, like someone trying to outrun a thought that followed anyway. She held no bag, no introduction. Just stood in the orange glow of the porch light and said, I think I knew him once. Linda stepped beside John. Knew who? Lily didn't answer. Not directly. Just looked past them, through the screen door, toward the figure sitting in the shadows by the fireplace. Tahu hadn't moved, but his head was tilted slightly, his gaze fixed on her like a dog who smells something familiar but can't place the source. They let her in, not out of trust, but instinct. Inside, the silence was soft but charged, like the moment right before a violin string breaks. Lily sat at the edge of the couch, eyes never leaving Tahu. I was 9, she began, voice low. We lived upstate. My dad was not the kind to bring things home, but one day he did. He came back with something alive. He said it was injured, but it wasn't. It was scared. John shifted his weight but didn't speak. I heard it at night, crying, like a baby, but not, like something pretending to be a baby. That's what made it worse, because I think it was trying to sound like one of us. My dad kept it in the basement, wouldn't let me near, said it was dangerous, said it would be worth something. Her voice cracked, not with drama, with exhaustion. I snuck down one night, just to see, and there he was, smaller, hair all matted, eyes too big for his face. He didn't growl. He didn't scream. He just looked at me like he wanted to disappear. Linda touched her wrist gently. I brought him fruit sometimes, granola bars, a toy once. He never took them, just stared. But one time, he reached for my hand. She turned toward the fire. Tahu hadn't moved. I touched him, right here. She raised her hand slowly and pointed to the base of her palm. His skin was warm, rough but warm, and there was a scar, a deep one, across the wrist, like a cable had been looped there too tight. She exhaled. Then, almost afraid, she whispered, "May I?" Linda nodded. Tahu stood, slowly. Not in fear, but something like recognition. He walked toward her with the quiet of a falling leaf. Stopped inches away. Lily looked up at him, blinking back something too old for her years. She reached forward, hands trembling, and gently took his hand. There it was, the scar. Same place, same shape. She held it like it was sacred, like it was her own memory she had to believe was real. "I'm sorry," she said. Not loud, not for anyone else but him. "I didn't know. I was just a kid, but I should have done something." Tahu pressed his hand against hers, palm to palm. Then, with a motion that felt too human for anyone who thought otherwise, he touched her cheek, just briefly, then turned away. Lily broke, not loudly, just collapsed inward. Linda caught her as she leaned forward, sobbing softly into her shoulder. John stepped out onto the porch, letting the screen door creak behind him. The night was full of sound, crickets, wind, the low groan of trees adjusting their weight. And then, somewhere beyond the far line of pines, came 3 soft knocks. Not from wood, not from human hands, but deep, resonant, like a drum made of bone and bark. John looked out. Nothing moved, but he didn't need to see it to know. They were out there, listening, calling. Back inside, Lily sat quietly, sipping warm tea with both hands. "You can't release him," she said. "Not alone. He's not wild, not anymore." Linda nodded. "We know. He doesn't belong in a cage. But he doesn't belong lost either. He's somewhere in between." Anna drew closer to Tahu. He let her. Outside, the night pulsed with meaning. The sound of trees breathing, of something old remembering something lost. And in the distance, the mountain answered again. Knock, 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 this time slower and closer. The full moon rose low and wide, caught between the branches like a silent eye watching from the trees. Its glow painted the clearing in silver, stretching long shadows across the dirt like fingers reaching toward the cabin. Wind brushed the roof like breath. Not harsh, just present, constant, as if the night itself had begun to lean in and listen. Inside, the room was dim. Firelight flickered against the wooden walls, dancing across familiar objects that suddenly seemed too still. The radio was off. The clock had stopped ticking. No one spoke. Even the children sensed it. That something unspoken had begun to stir. Tahu stood by the window, motionless. His body tall now, his posture not that of a child, but not yet a man. Somewhere in between. He didn't blink. His eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the tree line, as if waiting for a voice only he could hear. John watched him from the kitchen doorway, arms folded but not tense, just holding everything in. Linda sat near the stove with her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't sipped from. Steam had stopped rising a while ago. Then came the first knock. Not from wood against door, not from a person's hand, but from far away. 3 tones, low, deep, spaced apart like heartbeats. The same rhythm. Tahu flinched just slightly. His fingers twitched. Then came the second. From a different direction, echoed but closer. Then a third. Anna rose slowly, walked toward him without fear. "They're calling you, aren't they?" Tahu didn't nod, didn't answer. But he turned to her, eyes wide and wet with something that looked like memory. Then walked to the middle of the room and picked up the same piece of kindling he'd always used. He turned to the beam, stood still, raised the wood, then Tap, tap, tap. A long pause followed. Then, somewhere deep in the woods, an answer came. Not echo. Response. The fire cracked, the air shifted. Elder Walken appeared just after. No footsteps, just presence. He stepped through the open door like the woods had handed him to the cabin. No one was surprised, not even the children. He looked older than before, or maybe just more tired. "They've come," he said. "They've waited long enough." John stood. "Are they angry?" Walken shook his head. "No, but they are expectant. They've watched, they've listened, and tonight, they call." Linda rose. "Will he be safe?" Walken turned to Tahu. "That is for him to decide. The call is not a demand. It is an invitation. He must choose." Tahu looked between them, at each face, then at the door, and he walked. Anna reached for him, but stopped. Luke grabbed her hand. They followed. The family stepped out into the moonlight, Walken beside them, Tahu in front. He moved with purpose, but not haste, his shoulders straight, his steps quiet. Through the trees, the sound grew stronger. Not just knocks now, tones, harmonics, like a forest choir humming from the roots. A language not of words but weight, memory, blood. Then they saw them, at the ridge beyond the creek. Tall forms, still as stone. Dozens of them, shadowed by the trees but unmistakable. Shapes that defied the mind but made perfect sense to the body. They didn't growl, they didn't howl. They simply stood, watching and waiting. Tahu stopped near the edge of the clearing. The cabin behind him, the tribe ahead. One figure stepped forward. Larger, broader, a presence that pulled at the heart. Her fur was darker, her posture low, but her eyes, those eyes held something ancient, maternal. She stepped slowly, no rush, no threat, then lifted a hand, massive and calloused, and tapped 3 times against her chest. Tahu mirrored her, slowly, then took 1 step forward, another, and then she touched his head. Just once, and the night grew still. No breeze, no birds, just the moment. Then Tahu turned, looked back, at the porch, at John, at Linda, at Anna and Luke, and raised his hand, pressed it to his chest, then lowered it, and stepped into the woods. Not vanishing, not gone, just homeward. And behind him, the forest swallowed the sound. But the echo remained. The night ended the way some storms do, with a hush that didn't feel like silence, so much as a hand resting gently on a shoulder. The moon had slipped behind the ridge, and the mountains were the color of unlit steel. They kept their quiet like a pact. In that dim hour before dawn, footprints softened into the duff, breath joined breath, and the forest stitched itself whole around what had just happened. They followed until the trees decided they shouldn't go farther. John knew the line even if he couldn't see it. Some borders aren't painted. They're felt across the skin like a temperature change. He put an arm out without thinking, and Linda, and then the kids, slowed with him. Ahead, the figures stood in patient relief, tall enough to make the pines look younger, broad enough to turn shadows into clothing. They were there for the one the children had named. They had always been there, in the way winter is always there inside a September night, waiting without hurry. The young one didn't run. He moved the way a memory does when it knows it's time to return to the body that made it. He turned once. He placed his hand to his chest and held it there, not as a salute, but as a promise. And something in that gesture loosened and broke and healed the same second inside everyone watching. The tallest form came forward, wide-shouldered, fur dark as wet bark, eyes not bright but deep, and bowed its heavy head until brow met brow. A sound passed between them, low and wooden, like a knock on the inside of a tree. Then the gathering shifted as one, and the forest opened, and the young one stepped into it, like stepping into his own name. They stayed long enough to lose the shapes. That was the strange mercy of the ridge. It took with a softness that did not bruise. When the clearing felt empty, when the wind returned to being only wind, the family turned back. The path home looked different, though the trees hadn't moved. That's how it is with certain kinds of departures. You come back along the same ground, and every root and stone has a new meaning pressed into it. At the porch, the elder was already waiting. No footprints to announce his arrival. No breath hanging in the cold like a flag. Just a presence like weather. He did not need to be told what had happened. The woods carried news better than any telephone line. He nodded to John and to Linda and let his gaze rest on the children, not pitying them, not asking them to be brave, simply noticing them as if to say, "I see the ache and I respect it." They went inside. Nobody reached for the lights. The dawn was enough. The cabin held on to the last of the night in its corners. A thin walnut color pooled beneath the table, behind the stove, along the baseboards. It felt like a church before anyone speaks. The firebox was a bed of quiet red. John fed it with one small split log, not because the room was cold, but because it was good to have something to do with his hands. Coffee hissed and calmed. The kettle clicked once, like a distant pebble. Steam curled and disappeared. Linda poured without looking, and the smell lifted the room toward morning. Anna set out plates as if breakfast could keep the world in place. Luke arranged the knives and forks imperfectly, and then fixed them, his tongue peeking at the corner of his mouth with the effort of getting it right. A family can't help itself. It keeps making small repairs even when the damage is called change. They ate a little and left most of it. Not out of sorrow exactly, but because attention sits in the body differently on a day like this. A crow called from the far fence post, and another answered beyond the creek, and the air between those two voices felt like a road nobody needed to walk. When they stepped outside again, the elder followed them to the beam on the porch, the same beam that had learned the language of 3 knocks. The wood was scarred, but in a manner that made the scars look like script. He placed his palm there gently, as if touching a shoulder. "You returned him to blood," he said, and his voice held both granite and dusk. "But he will always be part of this house." It was not a blessing so much as a map drawn in a sentence. The day rose. The valley took it at a pace that made clocks embarrassing. Light found the nails in the door frame and made halos of them. Squirrels bickered. Far up the slope, a drift of elk moved as if they were one animal. The mountains kept their own counsel. Nobody asked them to do otherwise. They spent late morning where the creek bent, where a cottonwood had thrown a root across the bank like a silver arm. Stones warmed and cooled beneath their feet. Water threaded itself through last year's leaves, and the taste of iron and something green hung faintly in the air. Luke tossed a twig and watched it take the first curve, then the second, then vanish where the bend turned to glare. Anna drew lines in the wet sand with a willow switch. Loops and circles, the beginning of letters, the end of a story, both at once. Back home, Linda found the small polished square that had waited in the drawer, the piece of oak that had once been nothing and had become something because hands said so. 3 circles overlapped, burned in with a tip hot enough to turn the grain dark and glossy. Beneath them, 2 prints cut shallow. One the narrow oval of a child, one broader, with a softness at the edges where fur might meet skin. She held it for a while with both hands. Then she set it on the mantel beside the family picture where smiles were crooked, and the dog's tail was a blur, and snow fell on a day it had not meant to. John stood before the beam again. He didn't strike it. You don't speak just to prove you can. He let his fingers rest where the rhythm had once sounded. The wood was only wood now, and also more than wood. And it's a paradox people accept every day without naming it. He looked at the door as if someone might come through and then looked at the trees as if someone already had. He exhaled from a place low in his chest and let the breath go all the way out. Afternoon made a small ceremony of itself. The elder brewed cedar in a pot blackened by other fires and poured it into tin cups. The steam smelled like rain on a log and like something else that did not have a word. which is not a failure of language but proof of the world's size. They drank and did not toast. Some moments are better served by leaving the air unbroken. He told a short story that had no hero, only a lesson about streams that forget the rocks that cut them until they meet the sea and understand. The children listened. They would remember it later without recalling why it mattered, which is how most true things travel. Toward evening, the sky found its copper. A breeze came down from the pass, carrying the sound of branch against branch, bark tapping bark. It was not the rhythm they had learned, and yet it fit beside it, a harmony you only hear when you've been taught to listen. Shadows pulled long across the clearing and stitched themselves to the porch. Somewhere uphill, a woodpecker tried an old trunk and decided against it. The first star showed up with no fuss at all. They walked the property line once in the longer light. A habit and a kindness, the way you run a finger along the spine of a book you have just finished. The fence wire hummed a little where it brushed a brace post. Grasshoppers pushed air with their legs. On a fir near the north corner, 3 faint marks scored into the bark that none of them had put there. Not deep, not loud, just there. John touched them and didn't point them out. He didn't need to. The seeing was enough. Night does not fall in a valley like this. It arrives by degrees, a steady wading into deeper blue until your eyes admit the dark is here. The house gathered light the way a person gathers memory, first in handfuls, then in careful, smaller motions. Lamps glowed in their corners. The stove took a breath and let it out through the stovepipe. The old clock, which had wandered a little lately, found the hour and set it once. You could feel the ridge beyond the trees even when you could not see it. A big back in the dark, a shoulder holding weather. When the elder stood to leave, he did not offer advice he did not need to give. He put a hand on John's forearm, then on Linda's. He looked at the children as if petitioning them to be precisely what they already were. He stepped off the porch with a small drop of the heel that sounded like punctuation, and the night accepted him the way a lake accepts a stone. They watched him go because gratitude likes to be witnessed. Inside, they made the kind of order that allows sleep to trust a house. Dishes faced the same way in the rack. The quilt folded in its place. Ash banked. Shoes in a row by the door, toes outward, the way people do in Montana without asking themselves why. A home is a dozen unremarkable decisions made with care. In the last minutes before bed, Linda lifted the oak piece and set it again, just to feel the weight of doing it twice. She stood back and looked at the mantel. The photograph caught a reflection of the lamp and turned the glass into a thin square of dawn. She didn't say anything. She didn't need a sentence to carry what was already full. Sleep came, not all at once, not to everyone at the same time. It moved through rooms and down the hall like a creek in late August. Shallow here, deeper there, bright where the moon slips in. Somewhere around midnight, a breeze found the chime made from old spoons and made it talk softly to itself. Now and then the stove ticked as it cooled. A coyote tried a note and changed its mind. The valley kept its promises. Just before the hour when birds practiced their first song, John woke and went to the door. Not because he heard anything, but because the body keeps certain appointments whether the mind remembers them or not. He opened it and let the cool touch his face. The world smelled like pine resin and damp earth and the faint metal of dawn. He stood there a while. The threshold is a good teacher. It holds both sides without insisting you choose. Far up the slope, something moved the way a large thing moves when it knows it is seen and does not mind. It wasn't a shape so much as a certainty. He didn't lean out to chase it with his eyes. He let it be what it was, and because he did, the moment did not break. He closed the door when he was ready, and went back through the rooms that had learned his steps. The floor offered small creaks where it always did, and each one sounded like a reassurance. Morning arrived for its shift. The sun found the tops of the tamaracks and laid new brass on their needles. Frost released its hold on the grass in a sheen that retreated like a tide. The creek spoke up. Birds tested volume. On the mantel, light slid across the carved circles until they gleamed the color of toasted sugar. The photograph took the light and gave it back. The house lifted its head. They would tell the story later in fragments and gestures. A child would say it with a drawing, and then, years after, with silence. A woman would say it by remembering to set 2 plates the first week and 1 the next. A man would say it by repairing a hinge that had squeaked for too long and smiling to himself when it stopped. None of that would be the whole of it, and together it would be enough. Some things return in the ways they taught you to recognize them. A steady beat on the heart would. A line in the dirt that means home. A hand to the chest held for as long as it takes to make a vow. Some things do not return at all, and still they do not leave. The mind wants a map. The heart carries a field. If you stand at the edge of the porch when the light goes pewter and the ridge ahead turns to a darker version of sky, you might hear something like a drum, and it might be only 2 branches touching in a wind that learned restraint, and you might call it coincidence. Or you might feel the porch beam warm beneath your palm and understand that love, once given, keeps a room for itself and pays its rent in echoes. They had returned him to blood, and yet the house did not feel smaller without him. It felt larger, the way a room feels larger once a secret has been spoken and has chosen to live there. The beam would hold its marks. The oak square would keep its place. The photograph would catch morning, and the creek would gossip, and the mountains would keep quiet counsel, and the world would go on bearing what it bears. What we give away to where it belongs is never truly gone from where we belong. The door remains open in both directions. The path remembers our feet as surely as we remember the path. And in a life measured not by possession but by fidelity, nothing loved is lost, so long as the loving continues. Sometimes, the deepest connections aren't bound by language, blood, or even species. They're formed in the quiet moments. A shared glance, an outstretched hand, the rhythm of 3 simple knocks in the dark. They grow in silence, in patience, in the spaces where judgment ends and compassion begins. This was never just a story about the unknown. It was never about fear or survival, or even the mystery of what lies beyond the trees. It was about the courage it takes to see something different and still choose kindness. About how healing doesn't always come from answers, but from the decision to open a door and mean it. We live in a world that moves fast, where lines are drawn quicker than bridges are built, and where the unfamiliar is often met with suspicion before it's ever given a chance. But every so often, there comes a moment, a chance to look beyond what's safe or easy, and ask ourselves what it really means to care for something, or someone, that the world says doesn't belong. Because belonging isn't about fitting into a mold. It's about being accepted as you are, and still being loved. It's about presence. It's about memory. It's about the unspoken things that connect us in the quietest corners of the heart. And maybe, just maybe, there's a part of all of us that still waits to be seen, not for what we appear to be, but for what we carry inside. Our stories, our scars, our longing to be part of something more. So if this story stayed with you, even for a moment, we hope it reminded you of something good, something worth protecting, something worth remembering. Thank you for spending time with us in this world. If it moved you, even in a small way, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what this story made you feel, what it made you remember, and if you'd like to walk with us again into the woods, into the unknown, into stories that hold truth in unlikely places. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps keep these stories alive and helps us keep telling them the way they're meant to be told. Until next time, listen closely. Not everything that calls from the forest is a threat. Some things just want to come home.